Hello, welcome to the Global Church Project. I'm Graham Hill. Adam Taylor is Executive Director of Sojourners and author of Mobilizing Hope, Faith-Inspired Activism for a Post-Civil Rights Generation. Adam Taylor previously led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group and served as Vice President of Advocacy at World Vision USA and the Senior Political Director of Sojourners. He's also served as the Executive Director of Global Justice, an organisation that educates and mobilises students around global human rights and economic justice. Adam Taylor is a graduate of Emory University and Harvard University Kennedy School of Government and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. Taylor is ordained in the American Baptist Church and serves at Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria. Adam Taylor, welcome to the Global Church Project.
Thank you.
You've got a long history of social justice work and you're currently working with Sojourners. Can you tell us something about Sojourners and your role with them?
Yeah, so Sojourners is a Christian ministry that has been committed to social justice and peace, and really started with a group of seminarians that were at Trinity Seminary in Chicago. And they started speaking out against the Vietnam War, very much from a Christian perspective. It wasn't a very popular position to take at that time. And they were essentially forced out of the seminary. And they created a magazine called The Post-American that then later turned into Sojourners, particularly after they decided to move to Washington, D.C., because so much of what they were trying to address was tied to U.S. politics. And so we have been kind of a movement of Christians in the United States, but connected to Christians around the world, that really puts a strong emphasis on both spiritual renewal and social justice. And we've been kind of a voice through our magazine, which reaches many Christians across the U.S., but also in other corners of the world, including Australia. We have a digital publication that reaches a much broader audience and speaks to the intersection of faith and politics. And increasingly, we've been engaged in advocacy and mobilizing of a Christian kind of constituency in the United States that's been working on issues like immigration reform, racial justice, trying to combat domestic violence and sexual violence in the U.S., and trying to fight poverty both in the United States and around the world.
You've got a passion and belief in activism. Where does that originate for you? And it's a big question, but what fuels it for you as well?
Yeah, I should have just fully answered your question, which is that I'm now back as the executive director. So I got to know the founder, President Jim Wallace, when he was teaching a course my first year at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. I was studying public policy, and he was teaching a course on faith and politics. And the course was just really transformational for me. I then became his teaching assistant and then joined the board of Sojourners, and I've kind of had this connection to the organization ever since. And so I was on staff for about 5 years, starting in 2003 or so, and then left the organization to join the Obama administration for a year. I've done a number of things in between, but really felt called to come back as the executive director to eventually take over for Jim, because I really feel like in my kind of core sense of vocation and calling, a commitment to equipping and mobilizing Christians to live out the whole gospel and to advance justice. So for me, a lot of my commitment to justice really ties into my own story. So, and actually this year in particular is quite meaningful in that regard. So 1968 was the year Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, also the year that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated running for president. And it was also the year my parents made a controversial decision to get married to each other. So my mother's black, my father's white. When they got married in 1968, there are many states in the United States that banned interracial marriage. That same year, there was a Supreme Court case called Loving versus the State of Virginia that legalized interracial marriage across the country. And so they kind of made a decision to put their love over bigotry, and certainly experienced quite a bit of resistance from their family at the time. But ultimately, decided to get married, ended up having 2 sons, myself and my older brother. And they always instilled in me this very strong belief that I was made in the image of God, and that my diversity and our diversity as humans is a real strength and gift, not a liability or weakness. And I've kind of found that my biracial identity has enabled me to be a bridge builder, particularly across racial differences in the United States, but also even some of the work I've been able to do globally. And I grew up very much in the shadow of the civil rights struggle, became really passionate about that movement, and felt like my generation, Generation X, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. But a lot of my peers were kind of taking for granted the struggles that came before us. But Dr. King understood very clearly that the next frontier of the civil rights movement was to push for economic justice, that the civil rights victories were critical in terms of voting rights and civil rights, but that ultimately we had to be, addressing economic justice. And it's kind of the reason why he was supporting sanitation workers in Memphis who were fighting for a living wage when he was assassinated in 1968. And so I really kind of took on that mentality that I had to kind of engage my generation in a commitment to economic and social justice and to continue to push forward that kind of broader vision of building a beloved community. I went to college in Atlanta and had a chance to join Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is the spiritual home of Dr. King. And that's what kind of led me into the Baptist faith. I'd grown up Christian, but was more Presbyterian and went to a congregational church. But in Atlanta, I really discovered the kind of theology of the Black church that is always put together Jesus and justice. And, those two things are intertwined. And so I was wrestling with the call to ministry after college and ultimately ended up becoming ordained within the American Baptist Church and Progressive National Baptist Church.
In Mobilizing Hope, you talk about mobilizing and inspiring transformed nonconformists. Mm-hmm. What's a transformed nonconformist?
So I have to share his quote just to make sure I fully quote Dr. King on that one. So, a lot of people know Dr. King's speeches, and certainly I Have a Dream and others, Letter from a Birmingham Jail included. But his sermons were also quite powerful. In one of my favorite sermons by him, he did a remix of Romans and said, "The saving of our world from pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a nonconforming minority." It's kind of a mouthful, but it's basically these two concepts and commitments of being creatively maladjusted to the world around us and to be a transformed nonconformist. And for me, what that means is following a very radical and revolutionary Savior, Jesus Christ, who it wasn't political in the way that we might understand political today, but his ministry and his message had profound political, economic, and social implications. And he pushed up against a lot of the abuse of power that he saw among religious leaders and political leaders during his time. I think there's been kind of a danger within the Christian church to either overly privatize Jesus, so Jesus is only about my personal relationship with Jesus and faith is fire insurance from hell, or to kind of sanitize Jesus and take out the kind of radical implications of what it means to follow him. And so, a transformed nonconformist is someone who recognizes that following Jesus takes some sacrifice, it takes some risk, and ultimately we have to come on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed. Jesus started his public ministry proclaiming that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach the good news to the poor. So if our ministry is not good news to the poor, it's not the ministry of Jesus Christ. And that kind of has centered my understanding of what it means to be faithful.
The debate around the relationship between social justice and evangelism has sort of reared its head again recently. Well, what's your take on that discussion and how we should approach it?
It's a frustrating discussion because I think it's certainly a false dichotomy. I understand the historical nature of the debate. The evangelical church, and this is a little bit of a generalization, but evangelical church, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, kind of veered off in the direction of mostly focusing on evangelism, while more mainline churches really focus on the social gospel and on social justice. And I think one of the beautiful things about Sojourners is that our history tries to bring the threads of those movements together, to argue that there's no question, as Christians, we need a redemptive, transforming relationship with Christ. And that there's no kind of political system or recipe or ideology that is going to deliver the kingdom of God. They're all imperfect. But at the same time, we have to pursue justice because that is part and parcel to what the biblical prophets spoke to. It's part and parcel of Jesus' ministry and what it means to follow Jesus. And that being rooted in our spirituality can actually enable us to be oftentimes even more courageous and more resilient in our work for social justice. It's one of the things that fueled the civil rights movement, was certainly the involvement of the church. So, I think we've come a long way in some ways in kind of getting beyond that debate, but clearly there are still many camps within Christianity that have a hard time embracing social justice as being part and parcel to the gospel. And I think it's partially because they kind of conflate social justice with a particular kind of political movement or political ideology. And, the ultimate focus has to be what is going to bring greater hope and opportunity and liberation to all people, particularly the marginalized and the vulnerable. And there might be different paths to get there, but that has got to be our focus. And as Christians, if we were prioritizing protecting the poor, our politics would look very different in the United States and Australia and around the world. But unfortunately, we have a long way to go in that regard.
Do you think that transformed nonconformists come from one particular racial group or political bias or theological tradition? What's your sense about that question?
Well, let me put it this way. Anyone from any racial group or any kind of stream of the church can be a transformed nonconformist. That being said, I certainly think that the kind of liberation tradition and trajectory within the Black church in particular has probably modeled this the most, at least in the U.S. context. Certainly other streams of liberation theology in Latin America and in Asia have also tried to model this. Although I do think that there have been some streams of liberation theology that have gone so far in emphasizing justice that in kind of a social gospel, they've sometimes de-emphasized the kind of personal relationship with Christ. And so, again, both are really necessary. But, the Black church in many respects is probably the most evangelical church in America, even though the majority of Black Christians wouldn't identify as being evangelical, because evangelicalism has become so misappropriated and hijacked by the religious right in particular. And it's become this kind of theopolitical brand aligned with the white kind of Republican conservatism. And to me, that's a real danger. And it's actually really undermining the witness of the church in the United States. And it's causing a lot of young people in particular to leave the church. We're seeing a pretty significant exodus of young Christians from the church, including evangelical churches. And it's only gotten worse with the rise of Trump and Trumpism.
Well, a lot of young people, I think, want to be involved in politics but are uninformed or don't know where to start. So how do you help young people and not so young people become more informed about politics and social matters?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think part of it is helping young people understand the struggles that came before them that have enabled them, many of them, to enjoy some of the rights they have now. And to kind of understand that history requires an ongoing struggle. So Frederick Douglass, he was one of our great abolitionists, once said that progress always requires struggle. There is no progress without struggle. And I think that's an important thing to emphasize. Even in the United States, we have seen pretty significant setbacks from some of the gains that took place in the 1950s and 60s. We're still fighting to protect the vote in the United States because there's been a concerted effort to deny or suppress the vote among minority populations in the United States. Sojourners actually worked with another organization called the Skinner Institute to mount a very significant voter protection campaign around the country to try to ensure that clergy could work alongside lawyers to protect people's vote all around the country. So, one kind of lesson is that social change requires ongoing commitment, and it's not something that you can take for granted. I also think that you really have to tell the stories of where ordinary people have been able to make a significant difference. One of the challenges of how we look at history is we tend to kind of lionize the major figures. And, I'm a huge fan, as you can tell, of Dr. King. But Dr. King couldn't have led, a social justice movement or the civil rights movement without a whole army of people behind them. And to be honest, I have learned a lot more in terms of effective organizing and social change from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is the student arm of the Civil Rights Movement, than from King and some of the pastors that were also really critical. If it wasn't for SNCC, the student arm, I don't think you would have seen the type of change across the South. I mean, SNCC was the one that went into southern states and literally risked their lives to register people to vote. They're the ones that set up lunch counters all across the South to challenge Jim Crow segregation. And so, one of the things I try to emphasize with young people is that in a lot of social movements, not just the civil rights movement, but the anti-apartheid movement and others, young people have often been at the forefront of change. And I think that's a critical part of history that they should know, but they should also hopefully be inspired that they too can play that role around some of the most pressing issues facing the world today. I think that's starting to happen around the crisis of climate change and environmental degradation. I think young people could really help re-energize that movement. It's happening to a certain extent around human trafficking, and there's some examples where young people are certainly using their voice and getting engaged. It happened quite a bit in the United States over the last number of years with the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, it was young people primarily that fueled the movement to try to get the country to address racialized policing and police brutality and the killing of particularly unarmed Black men at the hands of police. And, that had been happening well before the Black Lives Matter movement started, but they forced that issue onto the agenda. And in some ways, they represent kind of a modern day version of SNCC that is pretty inspiring.
What do you think are some of the great social and ethical issues facing the US at the moment that the church needs to be a voice into?
There's many. So I think, particularly with the arrival and success of President Trump in the context of him winning the 2016 election, this is a moment in the United States where the soul of American democracy is at stake and the very witness of the church. As many people have heard the statistic that 81% of white evangelicals voted for President Trump, which is true. What a lot of people don't know, because the media doesn't report on this as much, is that 33% of self-identified evangelicals in the United States are people of color. They're Black, they're Asian, they're Latino, and their voting patterns were the exact opposite of white evangelicals. And so, unfortunately, within the United States, because of our racial history, with slavery being the original sin in the United States, and all of the challenges and struggles that have come as a result of kind of our struggle against white supremacy, the biggest cleavage in American politics remains race in many respects. But what's been particularly challenging and alarming is that a lot of white Christians have kind of put a premium on being white as being more important than being Christian. Put another way, it's like their sociology is trumping their theology. And, particularly the religious right has kind of made this Faustian bargain with the Trump administration, where they're willing to ignore all of his moral character flaws, or willing to ignore, the fact that he appealed to people's fears and their racism, or kind of appealed to racism and misogyny and to xenophobia in order to get elected. And as long as he appoints conservative Supreme Court justices, as long as he's willing to try to address the issue of abortion, as long as he tries to protect religious freedom, that those narrow issues, important issues, but narrow issues, can kind of forgive everything else. And I think that's a real danger and mistake. Dr. King had a great quote where he said, "The church at its best is called not to be the master or the servant of the state, but to be the conscience of the state." And the big mistake of the religious right is that they, in their history, or the course of their history, tried to become the master of the Republican Party. And in the process, I think often became the servant of the Republican Party, and really ended up corrupting some of their faith in the process. And I think that's happened even more so under President Trump. And so, for me, being the conscience of the state means holding all political parties accountable to your core values. And Christians can disagree on some of the best ways to live out and realize a commitment to the least of these, and commitment to protect the poor and vulnerable. But we should agree that that should be our priority, and we shouldn't become subservient to one political party or one political perspective. And so I think that's my greatest concern, is that the church, or at least parts of the church, are actually driving some of the polarization that we see in our politics. And again, they are creating an image of the church that is one of the biggest reasons that young people are leaving the church in droves. And most of those young Christians in the U.S. have a very high regard for Jesus. I mean, you ask them about how do they perceive Jesus, and Jesus was loving, tolerant, was committed to justice. You ask them about Christians in the church, and the three most common adjectives they use to describe the church is intolerant, it's hypocritical, and it's homophobic. And I don't want that to be how the church is understood and kind of remembered. So we have to do a lot to change that. There's been a movement in the United States that Sojourners helped to convene and lead, particularly the leadership of Reverend Jim Wallace, where he and Bishop Michael Curry brought together a group of elders who really reflected on this current political moment and crisis in the United States. And they created a statement called Reclaiming Jesus, a confession of faith in a time of crisis. And the statement really addresses this kind of spiritual and existential crisis we're facing in the United States, which also has lots of connections to what other countries are facing around the world, but really makes a very strong case and an argument that we have to be firm about some core theological commitments, which includes a commitment to Imago Dei, that we're made in the image of God. It includes a commitment to truth-telling and really opposing this kind of movement toward lying and fake news. It includes a commitment to honor and protect women and push back against misogyny. And so the statement, which has essentially 6 core principles, really struck a nerve. And we converted the statement into a video where we had the various leaders reading excerpts of the statement. So the statement was kind of endorsed by a pretty diverse group of Catholic, mainline, and evangelical elders from the church, many of whom were former leaders of their denomination. And this video just took off. And within a week, 1 million people had watched it. Within about a month, we had 4 million people that have watched the video. And we created a whole curriculum for churches about how can they have conversations about what's at stake right now. And to do it in a way that doesn't exacerbate the polarization, but really tries to help build bridges and unify churches around a shared commitment to address justice.
Sometimes in the church we pit justice against morality. Sometimes you hear some Christians say, well, actually, we're concerned about moral issues and you people who are only concerned about justice, or vice versa. What's your sense about that?
Yeah, I mean, I also think that is a false choice. Justice issues are moral issues, and moral issues are justice issues. And so, for example, Sojourners, over its history, has been a pro-life organization. And some people don't realize that. Now, we might define our commitment as being pro-life a little differently. We make the case that to be truly pro-life means to be committed to protecting life from conception all the way through death. And that would mean not only trying to reduce the number of abortions dramatically in the United States and around the world, but also a commitment to fighting poverty and fighting human trafficking, and fighting domestic abuse and all the things that threaten life. And our frustration with kind of how the religious right has defined the life issue is only through the lens of abortion, while ignoring the threats to life beyond birth. I think it's really important that we try to make moral arguments that are rooted in Scripture and that are tied to kind of a broader understanding of justice. So my understanding of biblical justice really comes from the 2 Hebrew words for justice. One is mishpat, and the other is tzedek. So mishpat is essentially how to make right decisions, how to judge and make right decisions. Tzedek is essentially righteousness, although we often interpret righteousness in a very individualistic way. But the Old Testament interprets righteousness in a much more communal way. It's about how things ought to be. And when you combine mishpat and tzedek, you essentially get this deeper understanding of justice, which is all about how to restore right relationships between myself and God, between myself and my neighbor, and myself and creation. And I think that kind of emphasis on right relationship is really something that we have to emphasize. And that gets us, beyond some of the more, polarizing conversations about just single issues. We have to apply that kind of ethic to single issues. And again, we may not always agree. Sojourners doesn't believe that criminalizing abortion across the board is the right way to reduce the number of abortions. It's actually been proven by history and evidence that when particularly low-income women have greater access to health care, when you make progress in fighting poverty, when you improve the adoption system, when you increase access to childcare, the abortion rate goes down dramatically. And so we've really tried to push for common ground solutions that you can unite the pro-life and pro-choice movements together around things that they can actually agree on. Of course, we get attacked from both sides. It's not a popular position to be in. But, again, that's sometimes what we have to do as Christians is really try to find what is actually going to enable us to make some progress. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that, even around a very charged issue like abortion.
What do you think are some of the features of a just society?
A just society is one where everyone's dignity is respected and valued. It's one where the common good becomes the very centerpiece for our public policy and our decision making. I think a just society is one where everyone is able to realize their God-given potential. And it's a society where we're focused on human flourishing. Now, even with all of those descriptors, it's obviously harder to then kind of build the right government and the right set of policies and economic system that enables us to achieve all those things. But, I think that kind of provides the overall scaffolding, if you will. One of the things that I use to describe what a just society looks like in the United States, particularly given the history I just talked about in terms of racism and the rest, is a society where your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your religion are not tied to privilege or to punishment. So in other words, you don't receive certain privileges just because you're black, you're white, you're brown, or if you're a man or a woman, and you're not punished excessively or arbitrarily because of those things. And unfortunately, we are a long way from being able to achieve that kind of goal. But I think that is what a just society really is about. And you can actually make a very strong secular argument that is kind of the just society that we should be striving toward. But you can also make a very strong biblical argument. And one of the things that Dr. King did so brilliantly is he was able to appeal to both kind of the American creed and the American Constitution on one hand, and the Bible on the other. And, the civil rights movement was open to everyone. It wasn't just a Christian movement. Lots of rabbis and Jewish leaders were involved. A lot of secular humanists were involved. And so, we have to be clear that our Christian faith doesn't give us a monopoly on morality, but it does enable us to engage in works of justice and to pursuing justice that is grounded in very strong biblical principles that can inspire many others, and not just ourselves.
Sometimes people suggest that what Australians are doing is beginning to adopt some of the issues that are spoken about in the US in ways that are not indigenous to our own context. But the truth is probably it's just that they're amplified in the US context, which is much larger than us. What do you think is going on for Christians when they put things like politic and race and even nationalism over and above their Christian identity or their desire for justice? What do you think is happening within our hearts when we do that?
Well, I think, one, those things separate us from God and become a form of idolatry. And I think one of the things that was so important about the civil rights movement is it communicated to white Christians that they were the victims of oppression because of racism, that a kind of racist mindset and racist belief system actually separated them from a relationship with God from a Christian perspective, but also made them deny a part of themselves and deny part of Imago Dei. And so, I think it's important that we make that argument. When in the context of nationalism, so in the U.S. context, it's being expressed in this kind of America First mindset and kind of policies. We have to remember that for God to love the world, that He gave His only Son for the world, not just for one nation. And the Apostle Paul compared the church to the body of Christ, to a human body, and when one part of that body suffers, all parts suffer with it. And I think it's important to understand that when we deny the dignity of someone in one context, that ultimately is going to kind of hurt our broader body. And so, I am confident that we have a lot of the spiritual and theological tools to effectively combat all the things you just named, nationalism and racism and misogyny. But we have to be much more courageous in communicating how those things violate the Word of God, how they deny the image of God in people. And for me, it just is so profound what the image of God is all about. When we think about how God's image is in each and every person. And so if we took that seriously and we took it to heart, I think it'd be much harder to be able to be kind of swayed by fears associated with who may be trying to come into our country, or fears around I might lose out if Blacks and Latinos become the majority in American politics. So hopefully that provides a little bit of an answer.
A pressing issue globally, and at the moment we're seeing it in the US as well, is asylum seekers. What does it mean for the church to stand in solidarity with and to welcome and embrace those who are displaced and seeking asylum?
Yeah, it's definitely become one of the flashpoints in American politics. We saw the president try to exploit that issue and lead up to the midterm election with this caravan of migrants who are fleeing persecution and violence in Central American countries and were coming to the U.S. I think it's kind of two things that are really important. One, we really have to be committed to trying to address some of the root causes for why there are 68 million or so displaced people in the world today, the most that we've seen since World War II. And there's a number of different key drivers, but a lot of those drivers are connected to climate change. They're connected to intractable conflicts in different corners of the world, whether that's in Syria or elsewhere. They're connected to extreme deprivation. And I'm not saying that all those have very easy solutions, but there's a lot that we can do to address those issues. In the U.S. political context, the Trump administration has actually been cutting aid to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the three countries that are, from which the majority of immigrants are coming from at this stage. And for me, that is just a completely misguided solution and approach. We should be increasing our assistance to those countries so that they can try to address the root causes of violence in their own communities. They can address the fact that in many parts of Guatemala, small subsistence farmers literally cannot make a livelihood because climate change has made so many of their fields barren, and it's forced them to flee as a result of extreme poverty. So, again, this kind of commitment to recognizing that we live in an interdependent world, and when one part suffers because of something that we might play a role in, or either direct role in, or because of our own mission, it's important that we provide leadership in addressing those things. I also think that it's important to remember just how much a commitment to welcoming the stranger is a theme across the Old Testament and New Testament. Christ was a refugee that fled Israel to Egypt in order to escape death. Across the Old Testament, there's a commitment to welcome a stranger, and when you do, you're welcoming God. And so it's not, easy to then just translate that into an immigration policy or refugee policy. But I think that ethic has to inform how Christians respond to the plight of refugees. And, based on core commitments in international law that are also based on some strong biblical ethics, we have to remember how important it is for our countries to welcome refugees who do have a legitimate claim to being to seek asylum. The challenge is that their plight has been so politicized, and again, you have these kind of strongmen in the world that are exploiting people's fears about the other in ways that I think are really unchristian, and we need to fight against that.
How do you help people work through the intersection between faith and politics? It's not always easy to navigate that space. But what are some of your thoughts about the ways in which we can do that?
Yeah, I think that being engaged in politics, particularly in a democratic system like Australia and the United States, and I'm not arguing these are perfect systems, but they at least are somewhat responsive to the voices and the votes of citizens. In that kind of system, it is critical to be engaged because our non-engagement is actually a political act. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said that our silence is actually a political act, and our inaction is a political act. And obviously those consequences were quite dire in the context of the rise of the Third Reich and Nazi Germany. But, politics is not a spectator sport. So if Christians feel like, we can just remain pure by not getting involved, and that will prevent us from corrupting our faith by making imperfect choices and who we vote for, the consequences of that is that we are essentially then endorsing and giving license to whoever gets selected and whatever outcome happens. And so, I think it's critical that Christians see political engagement as part and parcel to discipleship, that it is an expression of our discipleship to be engaged. Now, there's lots of different ways to be engaged. I think the most obvious one is to vote. And particularly in our context, because my ancestors fought and died for the right to vote, it is absolutely essential that not just me, but everyone exercises the right to vote, right? But it's also about all the ways in which you can use your voice and your own agency to affect change. A lot of people underestimate the degree to which you writing letters to your members of parliament, in our case, members of Congress, can make a real difference. You making a phone call to their office. We're here for the Voices for Justice conference here in Australia, and you're going to have a lot of young and older Christians gathering together to unite their voices to pressure Parliament around the issue of foreign aid and to really try to reverse this trend of pretty significant cuts to Australian foreign aid. I have seen firsthand how when a kind of constituency is built around an issue like foreign aid, and this happened in the United States, that is diverse, that kind of brings together lots of different voices, when they generate a kind of wave of letters, phone calls, op-eds in newspapers, when they kind of make this a priority issue, that can transform political decisions. And in the case of aid in the United States, we were able to do that successfully first with the HIV and AIDS issue. We kind of mobilized and organized a very broad coalition that was able to put the issue of HIV and AIDS at the top of the political priority list and was able to convince President Bush to announce a major initiative called PEPFAR, the President's Emergency AIDS Plan, that literally has helped put 13 million people across Sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean on life-saving treatment, which is just remarkable. It's, I think, one of the greatest achievements of the Bush administration. But in the process of doing that, we were able to help members of Congress understand that not only funding HIV prevention and treatment programs, but also funding broader health programs, funding kind of broader efforts around economic development was an essential part of how the American projected its best values in the world and how we help build a healthier and more safe and more prosperous world that ultimately benefits America. So kind of made the case it's the right and moral thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do, right? And we've been able to build up the larger we, a very durable constituency of support that has made foreign aid kind of bipartisan cause. So even after President Trump was elected in 2016, he immediately tried to make pretty draconian cuts to foreign assistance, U.S. foreign assistance. And he was rebuffed by Congress, who basically ignored his own budget and said, no, these programs are really important. And they had the backing of a lot of religious leaders and other voices that had built up the support over time. So I'm pretty hopeful that a similar thing can happen in Australia. And I'm just using that as a concrete example of how when we engage in political change, it can really have dramatic results. And it doesn't always require engaging in protest, as much as I believe in the importance of those in many circumstances. It can involve a lot less kind of sexier things like writing letters and, again, writing op-eds and building a relationship with your member of parliament, because that stuff really matters.
What do you love the most about your ministry?
I love the fact that I get to work on issues that I feel really passionate about. I get to do that in the context of the church. I get to work with the church in the United States, but also around the world. And that I really get to help the church better understand what biblical justice means and how to live it out, and to give the church greater tools to be able to live out a greater commitment to justice. And for me, I mean, it's a blessing to be able to feel called to ministry. So I didn't share this story earlier, but I really wrestled with the call to ministry for a long time. And I kind of fought God on this because I associate ministry with only going into pastoral ministry, which obviously is a really important expression of it. But I couldn't understand why I was so passionate about politics and social justice. And I felt like I'd have to kind of leave that behind if I went into pastoral ministry. Obviously, that was a false choice because, many examples of pastors that are deeply engaged in social justice, as they should be. But what I realized is that my calling was really around about equipping and inspiring the church to engage more in justice. And Sojourners is the perfect vehicle for helping to do that. And I've been able to be a part of a number of recent social movements. I mentioned the AIDS movement, but also was really involved in the Jubilee Debt cancellation movement. I've been involved in the immigration movement in the United States. I've been involved in the kind of movement around racial justice and trying to end mass incarceration. And while not all those movements have been totally successful, we have seen some pretty significant change and victories along the way. And so that is extremely gratifying.
What gives you the most grief or frustration in this ministry?
I think a combination of the degree to which the environment, particularly in the United States, is just so polarized, is something that just gives me a lot of anguish. And I think I thought we had made more progress as a nation when it came to kind of embracing justice and overcoming some of the demons of our past. And it feels like, some of those demons may have just been right below the surface. And again, President Trump was able to kind of appeal to some of those demons of kind of racism and fear around the other, et cetera. I also just get frustrated sometimes with the church. I love the church. It's like this tough love. But, the fact that we're still having these arguments about whether social justice or justice is a critical part of the gospel is pretty exasperating. I mean, I'll still have it. I'll still, but I mean, I don't understand how you can't read the Bible, at least if you understand the context in which the Bible was written. It was written from the underside of oppression, pretty much the entire thing. From, beginning to end, you are seeing the plight of the Israelites in the context of threats around them and an oppressive situation. The plight of the Israelites under Pharaoh is a perfect example of that. But then you get to Jesus, and Jesus is a poor Palestinian Jew living in the context of the oppressive and brutal Roman Empire that has, essentially enlisted and co-opted religious leaders to promote its own aims and ends through the Sadducees and Pharisees in particular. And, while Jesus had a spiritual revolution that was his primary objective, he also spoke directly against those systems. I mean, one example that often gets overlooked, he went into the temple, overturned the tables of the money changers, a very dramatic act. And he wasn't doing that just because religious leaders were defiling the temple with economic activity. He was doing it because they were selling doves and they were exploiting people with exorbitant interest that they were charging on loans. and was literally angry at the way in which that was abusing and exploiting people. And so that was a direct confrontation with the exploitative and oppressive economic system at that time. And so, again, I don't have to convince you, but I just feel like if we put the Bible in its proper context, and if we kind of used a hermeneutic of justice to understand the Bible, we wouldn't be having these arguments. And I'm not saying that to kind of ignore the degree to which, at the end of the day, we do need to be focused on salvation and redemption and forgiveness and all the other things that were core to who Jesus was and what he did on the cross and the power of the resurrection. But let's not ignore that he was pretty radical in his time, and he confronted a lot of the powers that were active in his time. And his message had a real message to them, and it should have a real message to the abuse and misuse of power today.
What's most misunderstood about the things that you say?
As we've been discussing, when I talk about social justice, a lot of people just associate that with a liberal cause, particularly in the U.S. political context, or they think that we're not emphasizing enough the importance of the role of the church or of salvation as what we should be focused on. And again, I don't see these as either or. One of my favorite texts in the Old Testament is Isaiah 58, where the prophet Isaiah talks about the kind of religious worship that pleases God. And he literally goes on to say that when you feed the hungry and you break the yoke of injustice, so in other words, you address the root causes of injustice, then your light will shine like a noonday. You will be like a well-watered garden. You will be called repairs of the breach, restorers of streets of dwellings. It's really poetic and beautiful text. But what I love about that text is he directly ties religious worship that pleases God with acts of compassion and justice. And then he goes on to say, when we engage in acts of compassion and justice, then we will experience more abundant life. We will experience the kind of fulfillment and wholeness that God wants for us. So it's not about our own savior complex of just helping others. It's about our own wholeness being tied into the wholeness of others. And again, that kind of sense of interdependence is just replete across the Bible. And for me, it should just end this argument about whether we should only be focused on evangelism, or we should be focused on justice, or we should only be focused on compassion, or whether we should focus on activism. We can chew gum and walk at the same time, and we have to understand that these things are very much intertwined.
If you could say one thing to the church today, what would it be?
It would be, let me qualify your question a little bit. To the Western church, it is time to recognize that the center of Christianity is now in the global South. And I actually think that the church by and large in the South has a lot less difficult time understanding the connection between evangelism and justice and between compassion and justice. Not to say there aren't still some challenges there too, but I just think that their theology is informed a little bit differently. And they're not as captive to this kind of Western Christianity, which often tends to be much more individualistic. So I think there's a lot of hope in the sense that the Western church, the American church, could learn so much from the explosive growth of Christianity across sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia and even parts of Latin America. And I actually think that there, over time, is going to be kind of a reverse missionary movement where those Christians are going to come to the United States and be able to share a gospel that I actually think is going to be quite important and powerful. I think that the church more broadly, now is the time for the church to be the church and to live out a more holistic gospel. And it is absolutely crucial, both for helping to inspire a lot of Christians to stay in the church, because I still believe in the church, and I believe that the church is really important and necessary, but also to try to transform our politics and our economics in a way that models God's kingdom come. And again, we can have some disagreements along the way about how best to do that, but let's have that conversation, not about whether we should be engaged in justice.
Adam Taylor, thank you for joining us for the Global Church Project.
My pleasure.
The Global Church Project is located at www.activism.org. theglobalchurchproject.com. On our website, you'll find a wide range of interviews and resources for colleges, universities, and churches. I look forward to your company next time. From me, goodbye.